The moment Clara Whitfield stepped off the eastbound stage in Abilene, Kansas, in the spring of 1873, she had exactly $3.40, a carpet bag with a broken clasp, and a name written on a torn scrap of paper she had pressed so tightly in her fist that the ink had smeared against the lines of her palm. She had been running for 11 days. Not the kind of running where you know where you are going, but the desperate, breathless kind where you only know what you are leaving behind. She had left Boston in the dead of winter with the kind of haste that leaves no room for sentiment, no room for anything other than the singular, driving need to put as many miles between herself and the life she had been assigned as humanly possible. She had sold her good pearls at a pawnshop on Tremont Street, bought a railway ticket as far west as her money could carry her, and when the railway stopped, she had boarded a stagecoach heading deeper into the territory, because west was the only direction that felt like it still had room in it for a woman with no plan and no future she wanted any part of. The name on the paper was James Colt. He was, according to her late father's letter, a rancher somewhere outside of Abilene who had once done business with the Whitfield family when her father still had a family worth doing business with. The letter was old, dated 1869, and her father had been dead for 3 years by the time Clara found it tucked inside a leather-bound ledger in what remained of his study. She did not know if James Colt was still alive. She did not know if he would remember her father. She did not know much of anything, and that, she had decided somewhere between Ohio and Missouri, was something she would simply have to make peace with. Abilene in 1873 was not the savage, lawless place that Eastern newspapers liked to paint it, but it was not the pastoral quiet of New England either. It was something in between, a town caught in its own becoming, with cattle drives ending in the stockyards that had made the town famous, saloons that hummed with laughter and argument in equal measure, and the persistent smell of dust and livestock that clung to everything. The main street was wide enough for wagons to pass 4 abreast, and the wooden boardwalks were beginning to show the signs of real permanence, with proper storefronts replacing some of the canvas tent structures that had dominated the town just a few years earlier. Clara stood in the middle of it all and felt, for just a moment, the full weight of what she had done. She was 22 years old. She had no husband, no family that would acknowledge her, no job, and no guarantee that the name on the piece of paper in her hand belonged to anyone who would help her. Behind her in Boston, there was a man named Gerald Ashworth who believed she was going to marry him, a man her mother had promised her to without her consent, a man who was wealthy and cold, and who had looked at Clara the way a collector looks at a piece of furniture he intends to own. She had overheard his conversation with her mother on a Tuesday evening in February, heard him say that she would come around once she understood the alternative, and she had spent exactly 48 hours after that making herself disappear. The stagecoach driver had told her that she could find directions to most of the larger ranches at the livery on Cedar Street, and so she squared her shoulders and walked, ignoring the curious glances from the men lounging against the posts of the general store, ignoring the way her boots, which were not made for unpaved streets, were collecting a thick rim of dust around their soles. The livery smelled strongly of horses and hay and manure, but the man inside, a heavy-set fellow with a graying beard and a friendly expression, looked up from the horse he was tending without suspicion. "I am looking for a ranch belonging to a man named James Colt," Clara said. She was aware that her voice had the clipped, careful vowels of the Northeast, that she sounded like exactly what she was, which was someone who had never been west of Philadelphia before last month. "Can you tell me where I might find it?" The liveryman studied her for a moment. "Colt's place is about 7 miles north of town," he said. "Big spread backs up against the creek. You could not miss it if you tried." "You got a horse, miss?" "I do not," Clara said. "Stage stop is 2 hours gone," he said, more to himself than to her. "I could rent you a wagon for the afternoon, bring it back by nightfall. That is, if you know how to drive one." "I drove a buggy in Boston," she said. "A buggy," he repeated, and there was the ghost of a smile on his face, but he was kind enough not to let it fully form. "Well, the principle is the same, $1.50 for the afternoon." She paid him $1.50. She could not truly spare and drove the rented wagon north out of Abilene with the afternoon sun tilting toward the west and the Kansas grassland spreading out around her in every direction, enormous and golden and so profoundly different from anything she had ever known that she felt, for the first time since she had left Boston, something that was not quite fear. It was something closer to wonder, though she could not have named it with certainty. The Colt Ranch announced itself before she arrived at it. There were cattle grazing on the long slope of a hill to the east of the road, dozens of them, and then more as she crested a gentle rise, a herd that spread across the land in that loose, unhurried way that livestock have when they are well managed and well fed. The house itself was a proper structure, not the sod home she had half expected from the stories she had heard, but a solid two-story timber frame building with a wide porch running its full length and a barn that was even larger than the house. There were outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a kitchen garden that was just beginning to show the first green of spring. She pulled the wagon up in front of the house and climbed down, and it was exactly as she was tying the horse to the hitching rail that a man came around the side of the barn. He stopped when he saw her. He was tall, somewhere in his late 20s by the look of him, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of sun-browned face that comes from years spent outdoors. He was wearing a worn canvas jacket over a blue flannel shirt, and his boots were the functional, practical kind that had seen considerable mileage. He was not what she had expected when she had imagined Elias Colt. He was too young, for one thing, and he was looking at her with an expression that was careful and measured and faintly curious, not the immediate suspicion she might have expected a stranger to show. "Can I help you?" he said. His voice was lower than she had anticipated, a warm baritone that carried easily across the yard without any apparent effort. "I am looking for Elias Colt," she said. Something shifted in his expression, something she could not entirely read. "My father passed 2 years ago," he said. "I am James Colt. I run the ranch now." She felt the news like a door closing. For a moment she stood very still, holding the piece of paper with the smeared ink, and she was aware of how ridiculous she must look, standing in a Kansas ranch yard with a broken carpet bag and Boston boots that were already ruined and a name on a piece of paper that belonged to a dead man. "I am sorry," she said, because she was, and because she could think of nothing else to say in that immediate moment. "Did you know him?" James asked. He had not moved from where he stood, but his posture had shifted slightly, become less guarded, and he was watching her with something that looked like genuine concern. "I never met him," she said. "My father did, a long time ago." "My name is Clara Whitfield. I came from Boston." "You came from Boston," he repeated, not as an accusation, only as if he was making sure he had heard her correctly, "to look for a man you had never met." "It was a complicated situation," she said. He regarded her for a moment, then looked at the wagon, then at the sky, which was turning the deep amber and rose of early evening. "It is late in the day to be driving back to town," he said. "Come inside. There is coffee, and you can explain the complicated situation." She hesitated, because she was a woman alone in a place she did not know, and the conventions she had been raised with were screaming at her about propriety and reputation. And then she thought of Gerald Ashworth and the alternative, and she picked up her carpet bag and followed James Colt inside. The interior of the house was clean and functional, the kind of space that had been kept orderly out of practical habit rather than any decorative ambition. There was a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall in the front room, a heavy table surrounded by chairs, shelves with books and account ledgers, and a few personal items that she did not examine closely. The kitchen was at the back, and it smelled of wood smoke and coffee and something savory that suggested someone had cooked a proper meal not long before. James poured 2 cups of coffee without ceremony and set them on the table, and Clara sat down across from him and told him the truth, or most of it. She told him about her father, about the business connection he had mentioned in the letter, about the 3 years since her father's death during which her mother had managed what remained of the family's social standing by making decisions that benefited the family's standing and not necessarily Clara herself. She did not go into exhaustive detail about Gerald Ashworth, but she told him enough that James Colt was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "And you had nowhere else to go," he said finally. "I had a name," she said. "Your father's name. It was the only connection I had to anywhere that was not Boston." He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. He was not a man who spoke quickly or carelessly. She was beginning to understand. He thought before he said things. "My father would have helped you," he said. "He was that kind of man." He paused. "I have a housekeeper who comes 3 mornings a week, but the house is not well managed, and I have been meaning to find someone more permanent. The pay is not extravagant, but it is honest, and there is a room off the kitchen that is private. If you are willing to work, you can stay." She looked at him across the table in the fading light, this stranger who had just offered her a lifeline she had not expected, and she felt the complicated knot of relief and pride and uncertainty that comes when something you desperately needed arrives in a form you had not anticipated. "I am willing to work," she said. "Then it is settled," James said, and he stood to pour more coffee, and that, Clara would later think, was the moment everything began to change. She settled into the rhythm of the Colt ranch, the way a person settles into a new climate, with some initial discomfort and a good deal of observation before any real ease developed. The room off the kitchen was small but dry and private, with a proper bed and a window that looked east toward the open grassland, and she woke her first full morning there to a sunrise that was so extravagant in its pinks and golds that she stood at the window for nearly 10 minutes simply looking at it. The work itself was not unfamiliar to her in its principles, though the scale was different from what she had known. She had managed a household before in the declining years of her father's fortune, when the servants had been let go one by one, and the family had quietly absorbed the labor themselves. She could cook, she could clean, she could manage accounts, and she had a practical orderliness that served her well in the large, under-organized space of the Colt Ranch house. James had 4 hands working for him. There was Tom, who was the oldest at 42 and had been with Elias Colt before James had taken over the ranch. There was Miguel, who was 25 and had come up from Texas with the last cattle drive and stayed on, quiet and competent and homesick in a way he never quite said directly, but that showed in the way he looked south sometimes on slow afternoons. There was Henry, who was 20 and who talked constantly about everything and nothing, and who reminded Clara of a puppy that had not yet learned to regulate its own enthusiasm. And there was Ned, who was 33 and skeptical of everything, who had regarded Clara's arrival with narrow eyes and a silence that was more eloquent than speech. She dealt with Ned the way she dealt with most things that were difficult, which was directly and without much drama. On her 3rd day at the ranch, she set a plate of food in front of him at supper and said, "I am not going to cause trouble here, and I am not asking for anything that is not offered fairly. I hope we can manage to be civil." Ned had looked at her for a long moment. "I do not have a problem with you, Miss Whitfield," he said, which was not precisely what she had said but which she accepted as the closest she was likely to get. James was different with her than she had expected. He was not unfriendly, but he was contained, and he carried something in him that she could not quite identify at first, a kind of careful distance that was not coldness exactly, but felt like a decision that had been made at some point and was being maintained by force of will. He was respectful and fair in his dealings with her and with his men. He worked as hard as any of them, sometimes harder, was up before light, and did not come in until the work was done. And he ate his supper with the focus of a man who was refueling rather than dining. But sometimes, in the evening, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, He would sit at the table with one of the books from his shelf and read, and occasionally he would look up and find her at the other end of the table with her mending or the household ledger she had begun keeping, and he would say something. It was never anything grand or significant. It might be a question about whether the flour was running low, or a comment about the weather changing, or once, a dry observation about something in the book he was reading that made her laugh unexpectedly. And then he would look surprised, as if he had not quite anticipated that the sound of her laughing would be something pleasant, and he would look back at his book with something very slight and unexamined shifting in his expression. She noticed it. She was not the kind of person who did not notice things. She wrote no letters to Boston. She did not tell anyone where she was. She had made her decision and she had committed to it, and the only person she thought about with anything other than relief at the distance was her younger sister, Eleanor, who was 16 and gentle, and who Clara hoped fiercely would be better protected than she had been. The spring deepened into early summer, and the work at the ranch expanded accordingly. The cattle needed to be moved between pastures. There was a section of fence along the north boundary that had come down in a spring storm and needed rebuilding, and James was in negotiations to buy additional stock from a drover who was passing through with a herd on his way north to the railhead. Clara learned the rhythms of the land faster than she had expected, because she was attentive, and because the ranch's needs were concrete and immediate in a way that made them easier to understand than the opaque social machinery she had navigated in Boston. She began to ride. It was Tom who taught her, with the patient, methodical approach of a man who had taught many beginners, and who did not believe in making the process more complicated than it needed to be. She started on a mare named Penny, who had the temperament of a patient schoolteacher, and who seemed to understand that her current rider was a work in progress. Within 3 weeks, she could trot and canter without looking as though she was having a medical emergency, and by the end of the month, she was able to ride out to the far pastures without an escort, which gave her a freedom she had not anticipated, but which she came to value enormously. The land did something to her that she could not have predicted. It was so large, so uncontained, so fundamentally indifferent to the small concerns of her particular life, that it recalibrated something in her. She began to understand why people came west and stayed. It was not only the land itself, though the land was extraordinary, it was the quality of space it offered. Not just physical space, but psychic space. Room to be someone the East had not already decided you were. It was on one of these rides, on a morning in mid-June when the grass was high, and the sky was the particular hard blue of early summer, that she came across James on the far side of the north pasture. He was sitting on his horse at the crest of a low ridge, looking out at the land, and he did not hear her approach until she was almost beside him because the wind was in the right direction, and Penny moved quietly on the soft ground. He turned, and for just a moment before his expression settled into its customary careful regard, she saw something else on his face. Something open and unguarded and a little aching, the look of a man who has been alone with something for a long time. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He looked back at the land. "I come up here sometimes," he said, not as an explanation but as if he had decided to tell her something true. "When I need to think." "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Below them, the herd moved in its slow, collective way across the lower pasture, and the sound of it came to them faintly over the wind. "My father built this ranch from 40 acres and a dozen head," James said. "He spent 20 years making it what it is. I have been running it for 2 years and I have not lost ground, but I have not gained any either, and sometimes I wonder if I am maintaining what he built or just delaying its decline." He paused. "That is a particular kind of pressure." "It sounds like it," she said. He looked at her then, and his expression was different from its usual contained courtesy. "I do not usually say that out loud," he said. "I will not hold it against you," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a real smile she had seen from him, not the brief, polite ones he produced when the situation seemed to call for it, but something that started deeper and reached toward his eyes. "I think I believe you," he said. They rode back to the ranch together, and they talked, and it was the first real conversation she had had with him, the first one that was not about the household or the ranch logistics or the practical business of the day. She learned that he had grown up on this land, that he had been sent east briefly for schooling, which surprised her, that he had read everything on his shelves at least twice and wished he had more books, that he had known since he was 12 that he would come back to the ranch and run it when his father could not, and that this knowledge had been simultaneously a comfort and a constraint his whole life. She told him about Boston, not the last terrible months of it but the earlier parts, the parts she still thought of with something like fondness, the library where she had spent entire afternoons, the harbor in autumn. The way her father, when he had still been himself, and before the business failures and the illness had worn him down to a hollow version of his former self, had read to her in the evenings from whatever he was currently absorbed in, sometimes Dickens, sometimes Thoreau, once for an entire memorable winter the collected works of Washington Irving. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," James said. "He was," she said. "He really was." The summer was full of small disasters of the kind that are part of any working ranch. A water pump broke and had to be repaired. One of the horses threw a shoe at the worst possible moment during a cattle move, and it set the schedule back by 2 days. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Vickers over the placement of a new fence line along their shared boundary, which required James to make 3 trips to town to see the county land agent before it was resolved in his favor. Clara, who was keeping the accounts and had access to the original land survey records, was the one who found the relevant documentation, and when she brought it to James, he looked at it and then looked at her with an expression that was genuinely surprised. "Where did you find this?" he said. "In the ledger box under your father's desk," she said. "There are all manner of important papers in there. Someone should have looked through it properly long before now." "My father was not a disorganized man," James said, and there was something fond and slightly defensive in his voice that made her think of the way she had spoken about her own father, and she understood that they were alike in this, in the way they carried their fathers with them. "He was not disorganized," she said. "He was just filing things in a system that was his own." James looked at the document again, and then very quietly he said, "Thank you, Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she was aware of it, the way you are aware of a small thing that is not small at all. Summer turned toward autumn. The nights cooled and the grass began its long, slow burnishing toward gold, and the work shifted as it always did with the seasons, from the expansive labor of summer to the more concentrated preparations for winter. There was wood to be cut and stacked, provisions to be laid in, equipment to be repaired and stored. The hands who had been hired for the season were let go, all except Tom and Miguel, who stayed on through the winters as full hands, and Ned, who had a standing arrangement that went back to James's father's time. Henry left with genuine regret and a promise to come back in the spring that Clara suspected he would actually keep. She found herself missing his relentless cheerful chatter more than she had expected. The days shortened. The house became quieter in the evenings, and the evenings became longer, and the table where she and James sat at opposite ends with their respective occupations became a place she found herself looking forward to in a way that she did not immediately examine. It was in October that the letter arrived. She knew before she opened it. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope, her mother's careful, practiced script, and she sat for a long time with it on the kitchen table before she picked it up. Tom had brought it from town, and he had not asked any questions, had simply handed it over and gone back to his work, for which she was grateful. The letter was brief and devastating in its efficiency. Her mother had located her through a cousin in Kansas City who had seen Clara's name on a register in a hotel where she had stayed one night during the journey west. Gerald Ashworth was furious. He had connections, her mother wrote, and was considering sending men to retrieve her. She would be wise, her mother wrote, to come home voluntarily and save everyone the embarrassment. Clara set the letter down and looked at the kitchen wall for a while. James came in for the midday meal and found her sitting there, and he poured himself coffee and sat down across from her and waited, because he had learned that she was not someone who needed to be prompted, that she would say what needed saying when she was ready. "I have to tell you something," she said finally. "All right," he said. She told him everything. The parts she had left vague in her initial explanation she made specific. She told him about Gerald Ashworth, about the arrangement her mother had made, about the conversation she had overheard, about the 48 hours of planning and the disappearance and the 11 days of travel. She told him about the letter and what it contained. She told him she was not sorry she had run, but that she was sorry she had not been entirely honest with him when she first arrived. James was quiet for a long time after she finished. "This man," he said, "Ashworth, you believe he would actually send someone after you?" "I believe my mother believes it," she said, "and she is not a foolish woman." "What do you want to do?" he said. The question surprised her, not because it was unreasonable, but because it was the right question, which was not always the one people asked. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to go on doing what I am doing. I have built something here, small as it is, and I do not want to give it up." He looked at her steadily. "Then you will stay," he said, "and if this man sends anyone to this property looking for you, I will handle it." "I do not want to cause trouble for you," she said. "You are part of this ranch," he said, with a simplicity and directness that left no room for argument. "That is not in question." She looked at him across the table, at the serious, careful face that she had been observing all these months, learning its expressions the way you learn a landscape you walk through every day, and she felt something shift in her chest, something that moved from one place to another and settled somewhere new, somewhere it intended to stay. "Thank you," she said. "That is the second time you have made it possible for me to breathe." He looked briefly away and then back at her. "You make it easier to run this place than it has been in 2 years," he said. "That is not a small thing." It was not a declaration. It was not anything except the truth stated plainly, and she understood that it was more meaningful for that, coming from a man who did not say things he did not mean. Nothing happened immediately with the threat from the letter. The weeks passed and no one appeared at the ranch asking after her, and gradually the particular cold weight of it faded from the front of her mind, though it never left entirely. She wrote a letter back to her mother, a carefully worded document that was firm without being cruel, telling her mother that she was well, that she was employed, and that she would not be returning to Boston to be handed over to a man who had made it clear she was a possession to be acquired and not a person to be known. She told her mother she loved her. She told her mother she hoped her sister Alina would be given better choices than she had been. She sealed the letter and gave it to Tom to mail from town, and did not expect anything good to come of it, but she felt cleaner for having written it. November brought the first hard frosts, and the ranch contracted around its winter rhythms, and the evenings at the table stretched longer and became more companionable. James had received a new shipment of books from a catalog he ordered from, 3 novels and a history of the Western Territories, and he shared them with her in the easy way of someone who has always wished there was someone to share things with, and has not known how much he missed it until the opportunity presented itself. She read by lamplight and he read beside her, and sometimes one of them would read aloud a passage that seemed too good to keep to themselves, and the other would listen, and the lamp would throw its warm circle over the table, and outside the wind would move across the Kansas plain in the particular sweeping way of winter, and inside it was warm and quiet and real. She was beginning to understand that she loved him. She did not rush toward the understanding. She let it settle and clarify and become certain before she acknowledged it even to herself, because she had made enough impulsive decisions in the last year, and she wanted this one to be clear-eyed and sure. But it was sure. It had been building since the morning on the ridge, since the first time he had used her name, Since the moment she had watched him argue with Vickers at the fence line, with a firm, quiet patience that never once tipped into cruelty. Since every evening at the table and every morning when he came in for breakfast with the cold still on his jacket, and said good morning in that low voice that had become the most ordinary and necessary sound in her day. She was sure. The question was what he felt, and he was harder to read, because he was a man who had learned to contain things. The answer came in December, on an evening of particular cold when the wind was sharp enough to hear through the walls, and she had made a stew that filled the house with a warmth that was both practical and something more than practical. And they had eaten, and she was washing up, and he was at the table, and she could feel him watching her in a way that was different from the usual comfortable awareness of each other's presence. She turned, and he was standing now, which she had not heard him do, and he was closer than she expected, and he had an expression on his face that was stripped of all the careful management she had become accustomed to seeing there. "I need to say something," he said. "All right," she said, because she had learned this from him, the value of a calm, receiving response. "I do not know how this happened," he said, and his voice was not the even baritone she knew. It had a rougher quality, the sound of someone speaking through something difficult. "I did not expect it. You came here with a name on a piece of paper and a broken bag and boots that were entirely wrong for Kansas, and I was only trying to do what was practical, what my father would have done, and somewhere in all of that I stopped being practical about you." She did not move or speak. "I am not a man who says things like this easily," he said. "You know that. You have been watching me for 7 months, and you know what I am like, and I am asking you to take that into account when I tell you that what I feel for you is not practical at all, and it has not been for quite some time." "James," she said, "I know you came here running from something," he said, "and I know you built something here that is your own, and the last thing I want to do is make this place feel like another thing pressing in on you. So if you do not feel the same way, you can tell me that and nothing changes. Your place here does not change. I want you to know that before anything else." She looked at him for a long moment, at this serious, contained, decent man who had given her a room and honest work and safety when she had nothing, who had shared his books and his land and the particular silences of his evenings, who had told her about the pressure of his father's legacy on a ridge in the morning light in June, who had said you are part of this ranch with a simplicity that had rearranged something in her. "I have been in love with you since October," she said. "Perhaps longer. I have been trying to be sure before I said it." He exhaled, a long, unsteady breath that was the most vulnerable thing she had ever seen from him, and then he crossed the small distance between them and took her face in his hands with a care that was almost painful in its gentleness, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the wind moved across the Kansas plain outside, and the lamp burned steady on the table, and that was that. They were not foolish about it. They were not young people who confused the excitement of new feeling for the whole substance of a thing. He did not propose to her that evening, and she did not expect him to. What they had was real and serious, and deserved to be real and serious about its own terms. They talked that night for a long time about what this meant, about what they each wanted, about the practicalities and the difficulties and the extraordinary fact of it. She told him she wanted a life she had chosen, not one she had been given. He told her he had watched his parents build a partnership out of two people who respected and genuinely liked each other, and that this had seemed to him, all his life, the only model worth pursuing. "My mother used to say that the land teaches you everything," he said. "It teaches you patience and humility, and the value of showing up every day regardless of what you feel like. She said a good marriage is like good land. You do not get anything from it that you do not put in." "Your mother sounds very wise," she said. "She was," he said. "She died when I was 14. I have been quoting her to myself ever since." She reached across and took his hand, which was large and rough-skinned and warm, and he turned it over and held hers properly, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight. January came with the full weight of a Kansas winter, and the days were short and often brutal with cold. But the ranch held its own against the season, as it was built to do, and the interior of the house was warm and well-stocked, and filled with a quality of life that Clara had not expected when she had driven out of Abilene 9 months earlier in a rented wagon with a broken carpet bag. It was in January that Gerald Ashworth arrived. She had almost stopped expecting it. 8 months had passed since the letter from her mother, and no one had appeared, and she had allowed herself to believe that perhaps the threat had been her mother's exaggeration, or that Ashworth had found someone else to acquire and had lost interest in pursuing her. She had almost allowed herself this belief, and then on a gray Tuesday morning 2 men rode up the road to the ranch. James was in the barn when they arrived, and Clara was on the porch with a basket of washing she was bringing in from the line before the cold could finish stiffening it. She saw the men coming and she knew, with the immediate animal certainty of someone who has spent 8 months in a low-grade state of vigilance, that this was what she had been watching for. They were not cowboys. They were wearing the kind of clothes that spoke of Eastern money, spent on Western travel, good quality that was being treated carelessly, and one of them had the particular bearing of someone who had been hired to locate things. James came out of the barn as they were dismounting, and he stood between them and the porch with a natural authority that came not from any display of aggression, but from the simple fact of being a man who belonged absolutely to the ground he was standing on. "Can I help you?" he said. It was not quite a question. "We are looking for a woman named Clara Whitfield," said the larger of the 2 men. "We have reason to believe she is employed here." "What business do you have with her?" James said. "That is a private matter," the man said, "between her and the gentleman who sent us. If you have a legal claim of any kind to anyone on this property, I will need to see documentation," James said. "Otherwise I will ask you to state your business plainly or get off my land." Clara set down the washing basket and came to the edge of the porch. "I am Clara Whitfield," she said, "and I am here because I choose to be, not because I was brought here, and whatever Gerald Ashworth has told you about his claim on me is untrue. There is no legal claim. I am a free woman who left voluntarily and broke no law in doing so." The 2 men exchanged a look. "Mr. Ashworth is prepared to be generous," the larger one said. "There does not need to be any trouble." "There will not be any trouble," James said, "if you ride back the way you came and tell whoever sent you that Miss Whitfield is not available to be retrieved. She is employed here, she is here of her own will, and she will make her own decisions about her own life. Those decisions are not subject to Mr. Ashworth's preferences." There was a moment of assessment, the kind that happens when 2 sides are determining the actual stakes of a situation. Clara watched the 2 men look at James and look at the ranch, and make the calculation that James had stated the terms clearly and would stand by them, and that whatever they had expected to find, it was not this. "We will report back," the larger man said finally. "You do that," James said. They rode out. James stood and watched until they cleared the gate, and then he turned back to the porch and looked at Clara, and there was something in his face that was not anger exactly, but that was in the general vicinity of it, the contained, purposeful version of it that a decent man carries when something decent has been threatened. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She was surprised to find that it was true. "I am all right. I want to talk to you about something," he said. "Not right this moment, but today. Will you be available this afternoon?" "I will," she said. She spent the morning trying not to think too hard about what he might want to discuss and failing fairly thoroughly at this effort. She went through the household work with her usual efficiency, and had lunch on the table at noon, and ate it mostly in silence, and James ate without pressing conversation on her, which she appreciated. In the afternoon, he found her in the kitchen going through the winter inventory, and he sat down across from her and placed his hands flat on the table in the deliberate way he had, as though he was steadying himself against the wood. "Those men are going to go back to Ashworth," he said. "And Ashworth is going to have to decide whether he presses the matter further or lets it go. I have no guarantee which way he goes. I think he is likely the kind of man who does not like losing, which means he may try something else. "I think that is probably right," she said. "I have been thinking about what kind of protection is actually available to you," he said, "what the law can and cannot do, and I have been thinking about what is in my power." She waited. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of the men who rode up this morning. I want to say that plainly. I was going to ask you before spring, and I was working up to it in my own way. But those men coming here made me say it today instead of waiting, because a wife on this ranch has protections that an employee does not, and I want you to have those protections. And I want to marry you. Both of those things are true at the same time." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table between them, and outside the wind moved through the dry winter grass with a sound like breathing. "If you are asking me," she said, "then yes. The answer is yes." His expression did something complicated, and then resolved into something she had never seen from him before. Something like relief and joy arrived at together after a considerable journey, and she felt the corresponding thing in herself, the particular happiness of a right answer to a question you have been carrying. "Yes," she said again, because it was worth saying twice. They were married in March of 1874, in Abilene, in the church that was still one of the newer buildings on the main street, by a minister who had the friendly, businesslike approach of a man who married several couples a month and found genuine satisfaction in the work. Tom and Miguel and Ned were there, and Henry, who had come back in February as promised, and a few of the neighboring families who had become acquaintances over the months of Clara's time on the ranch. Tom's wife, a stout, good-humored woman named Bess who Clara had come to like enormously, stood with Clara through the ceremony and pressed her hand hard at the moment when it mattered most. The minister asked James if he took this woman, and James said he did, and his voice was clear and steady and entirely without qualification. The minister asked Clara if she took this man, and Clara said she did, and meant it with the whole of herself, with the self that had fled Boston and the self that had stood in an Abilene yard with a smeared name on a piece of paper, and the self that had been built and rebuilt over the months of the Kansas plain, and the self that knew, with a certainty she had never felt about anything decided for her, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. They put the plain gold band on her finger, which James had purchased in Abilene 3 weeks earlier, and which had been sitting in the top drawer of his desk ever since, a fact Tom had mentioned to her with enormous satisfaction on the morning of the wedding, and she wore it on the ride back to the ranch in the wagon with James beside her, and the spring sky enormous and blue above the open land. "Mrs. Colt," James said, trying it out, as they turned off the main road onto the ranch road. "It sounds strange," she said. "Give me a week." "You can have as long as you need," he said, and he took the reins in one hand and reached over with the other and took her hand, and they drove the rest of the way home like that. What she had not anticipated, and what turned out to be one of the most significant revelations of the first year of her marriage, was how much she loved the land itself. She had come to it as a stranger, had tolerated it at first and then admired it, but loving it was something else, something she arrived at gradually and then completely. She loved the way the light moved across the grassland at different hours, the long shadows of early morning and the hard, bright noon and the amber warmth of late afternoon. She loved the way the weather was never small or tentative. It arrived fully committed to whatever it was doing. She loved the way the horizon was always visible, the way there was always sky above you in proportions that reminded you of your actual place in the order of things, which was small, which was humbling, which was honest. She and James worked the ranch together in the second year of her time there, in a way that felt genuinely collaborative. The kind of partnership she had heard was possible between two people who respected each other's minds and were paying attention. She had a talent for the financial management that James was grateful for, and said so directly. He had a talent for the land itself, for reading the grass and the cattle and the weather, for making decisions in the field that were instinctively correct in ways he could not always articulate, but that held up to later analysis. She handled the accounts and the correspondence and the procurement, and she had begun, tentatively and with genuine interest, to learn more about the cattle operation itself, accompanying James on the pasture rounds, asking questions that he answered with the kind of patience that indicated the questions were good. In the summer of their first year of marriage, something happened that Clara had not been expecting, not because it was impossible, but because she had been so focused on the largeness of the life she was building that the particular intimate detail of it had not fully occurred to her yet. She went to see the doctor in Abilene in August of 1874, and he confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, and she drove home in the wagon with the news settling over her in layers, each one a little different from the one before. She told James that evening at the table, with the lamp lit against the early dark of August evening. She told him simply and directly, the way she told him most things, and watched his face. He was very still for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, an expression that was so open and unguarded and full that it erased the last traces of the careful distance she had noticed when she first arrived, the managed containment that was just barely still visible sometimes at the edges of his usual expression. He looked at her as though everything he had ever been protecting himself from feeling was suddenly entirely welcome to arrive. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. "That is the important thing." "James," she said, "I am very happy," he said. "I want you to know that I am the kind of happy that I do not quite have adequate language for." "I know," she said. "I can see it." "Can you?" he said, and there was something young in his voice for a moment, something she did not often hear. "You are not as unreadable as you think you are," she said. "Not to me." He got up and came around the table and sat beside her instead of across from her, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that for a long time in the lamplight, not talking, just present in the fact of it. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was mild enough to be manageable, and Clara's health was excellent throughout, which she was grateful for, and which seemed to reassure James in a practical way that helped him manage the more anxious parts of waiting. He was attentive without being overbearing, which was a balance she appreciated because she had heard enough from other women to know that not all men managed this. He made sure the house was warm. He carried things she would have carried herself without making a ceremony of it. He came in from work at regular hours rather than the longer stretches he would sometimes work in the summer. Their son was born in April of 1875, in the house on the Colt Ranch, delivered by a midwife named Mrs. Horton, who had come out from Abilene, and who was practical and capable, and who spoke to Clara throughout in a calm, matter-of-fact manner that Clara found enormously helpful. James waited in the front room and wore a path in the floorboards that she found evidence of afterward in the scuff marks on the wood, which made her love him with a particular tenderness. The baby was healthy and loud and had James's dark hair and, in Clara's opinion, James's general expression of serious attention, though James said he did not see it. They named him William after James's father, whose middle name it had been and who had come before both of them and made possible the life they were living. "Hello, William," James said, holding his son for the first time in the chair by the bedroom window, with the April light coming in soft and clear, and his voice was the quietest she had ever heard it. "I have been looking forward to meeting you." Clara watched him from the bed, still tired but deeply and particularly awake, and thought that she had traveled a very long way from Boston to arrive at this moment, and that every difficult mile of it had been exactly worth it. Tom and Bess came to see the baby and brought food enough for a week. Miguel brought flowers from somewhere, prairie wildflowers gathered on the morning of the visit, still wet with dew. Ned came and looked at the baby for a long time without saying much, and then said gruffly that he was a good-looking boy, which from Ned was essentially a formal celebration. Henry talked for 45 minutes about what he thought young William would be like when he grew up, and everyone let him. In the summer of 1875, a letter arrived from Clara's sister Eleanor. Eleanor had tracked her down through a combination of determination and luck. The same cousin in Kansas City who had located Clara for their mother had apparently, once Clara's situation became clearer, decided that Eleanor deserved to know her sister was alive and well, and had eventually shared the information. The letter was 6 pages long and written in Eleanor's slightly unsteady hand, and it was the most important letter Clara had ever received. Eleanor was 18 now. She had refused 3 marriage arrangements their mother had attempted in the years since Clara's departure, and the most recent refusal had resulted in a genuine rupture with their mother that Eleanor described with more matter-of-fact clarity than self-pity. She was living with the Kansas City cousin and working as a seamstress. She was not unhappy. She asked Clara if she might come for a visit. Clara read the letter twice and then went to find James. "My sister wants to visit," she said. "Your sister should come," he said without hesitation. "She is in Kansas City. She could come by train to the Abilene stop. She is 18 and she is managing on her own, which I know because it is what I taught her to do," Clara said, and there was pride in her voice that she did not try to modulate. "Write to her today," James said. "Tell her to come whenever she likes and stay as long as she wants." Eleanor arrived in August of 1875 on the afternoon stage, and Clara was at the stage stop to meet her. And when Eleanor stepped down onto the Abilene street and they saw each other for the first time in 2.5 years, they held each other for a long time in the middle of the boardwalk while the other passengers worked around them. Eleanor was taller than Clara remembered, or perhaps only straighter, with the kind of self-possession that comes from having made difficult decisions and survived them. She met James at the ranch with a frankness that was clearly a family trait and made him smile, and she met William with such immediate and genuine delight that William, who was 5 months old and generally discriminating in his affections, seemed equally delighted with her. Eleanor stayed for 2 months. During those 2 months, she and Clara talked in the way that sisters who have been separated by circumstances talk when they are finally given time, which is to say they talked about everything, the past and the present and the future, and all the particular textures of a shared history scene from 2 different vantage points. They talked about their father, who they had both loved. They talked about their mother, whom they understood in different ways and who they both, in the end, forgave without entirely excusing. They talked about Gerald Ashworth, who had apparently, following the incident with the 2 men in January, decided that Clara's absence was preferable to the complications of further pursuit, particularly given that she was now a married woman on a ranch in Kansas with a husband who had made his position on the matter perfectly clear. He had married someone else in the spring of 1874, a woman whose father had business connections Ashworth valued more than he had ever valued Clara herself, which was, Clara had long suspected, the actual basis of his interest in her. "Are you glad you ran?" Eleanor asked her one evening, sitting on the porch with William asleep in Clara's arms and the stars beginning to show in the darkening sky. "I am glad I ran towards something, even if I did not know that was what I was doing," Clara said. "I had a name on a piece of paper. I had no idea what I was going to find." "What did you find?" Eleanor said. Clara looked out at the Kansas evening, at the grass moving in the late summer wind and the lights of the bunkhouse and the barn's dark shape against the pale sky. James would come in from the south pasture in the next half hour, she knew, because she knew his rhythms the way she knew her own. He would smell of horses and hay and the particular clean outdoor smell of him, and he would come up onto the porch and ask about William, and then he would sit with her for a while before dinner, and the evening would arrange itself around the fact of him, the way all their evenings did. "I found out who I was," Clara said, "and I found someone worth being it with." Eleanor left in October with a standing invitation to return whenever she liked, which Clara meant absolutely, and which Eleanor promised she would use. She went back to Kansas City with a letter of introduction from James, to a seamstress acquaintance of his in the city who was looking for skilled help. A connection that Alina turned into a proper position within a month, and which began, Clara later learned, a career that would eventually lead Alina to owning her own dress shop by the time she was 25. The years at the Colt Ranch had a texture and quality that Clara tried sometimes to describe to herself as they moved through them, as though she was trying to make sure she was not taking them for granted. She was not the kind of person who left life unexamined. She paid attention. She paid attention to the way the ranch changed and grew, how James made the land decisions with a combination of her financial analysis and his own deep knowledge of the place, and how the combination worked better than either alone would have. In 1876, they bought the parcel of land to the east that had been in dispute since Vickers retired and sold his holdings, and the acquisition brought the Colt Ranch to a size that James's father had always intended it to reach. James stood at the fence line on the day the paperwork was finalized and looked at the new eastern boundary, and Clara stood beside him and felt his satisfaction as clearly as if it were her own. "Your father would have been pleased," she said. "He would have been impossibly insufferable about it," James said, and he smiled, the full smile she had watched him arrive at slowly over the years, no longer the almost smile of their first months together but the real thing, open and warm and entirely his. She laughed because she laughed more easily than she used to, and he looked at her the way he still looked at her after 3 years, with a directness that was not casual, that had not become casual, that she hoped would never become casual. William was walking by the time he was 11 months old and talking by 14 months, and had, by the age of 2, the determined self-sufficiency of someone who has decided that the world is interesting and intends to investigate it thoroughly. He followed his father around the ranch with a dedication that both of them found amusing and moving, and James taught him things at an age when many fathers would have said the child was too young to learn, because James understood, from his own childhood, that children learn most when they are given something real to engage with. Clara taught William to read from the books on the shelf, beginning with the simplest ones and moving forward at the pace his attention and ability could sustain, which was faster than she had expected. She had not realized, until she sat down with her son and a book, how much she had internalized her own father's approach to this particular kind of teaching, the patience and the genuine enthusiasm for the material that made learning feel like exploration rather than instruction. It pleased her enormously to discover this in herself. The winter of 1877 was the hardest the ranch had seen in Clara's time there. It came early and was relentless, with storms that kept everyone inside for days at a time and cold that was deep enough to kill livestock that were not properly sheltered. They lost 3 head to a storm in December, and it could have been more, but Tom and Miguel had worked through a blinding night of wind and snow to get the rest of the vulnerable animals under cover, and James had been out there with them, all 3 of them coming in afterward looking like men who had been remade out of ice. Clara had hot food and dry clothes and fire waiting, and she pressed James into the warmth of the kitchen with her hands on his face and said, "You are all right," in a tone that was not a question but a determination, and he looked at her over her hands and said, "I am all right," and they stood like that for a moment before he let her push him toward the fire. That winter they spent long evenings that were both confining and somehow precious, with the storms outside and the warmth inside and William entertaining himself with increasing creativity on the front room floor while his parents read or talked or played cards. James taught Clara cribbage, which she disliked, and she taught James poker, which he turned out to be naturally gifted at, which surprised her because he was such a fundamentally honest man. And she told him this, and he said that honest men were better at poker because they were not distracted by the effort of managing their own deceptions. By February she was fairly sure she was pregnant again, and the doctor's visit in March confirmed it, and she came home and told James, and watched the particular version of that expression she had first seen in August of 1874 move across his face again. Only this time it was accompanied by a slightly more practiced calm that held all the same feeling in a more settled vessel. "Two," he said. "Two," she confirmed. "William is going to have opinions about this," he said. "William has opinions about everything," she said. Their daughter was born in November of 1877, during a week of cold but clear weather, and she arrived into the world with a kind of determined vigor that suggested she had places to be. She was smaller than William had been at birth, but loud in a way that rendered size irrelevant. She had Clara's coloring, lighter than James's, with the particular shade of dark blonde that Clara's own hair had been before Kansas sun had pulled it several shades lighter. They named her Margaret, after James's mother, which was Clara's suggestion, made one evening when they were still discussing names, and James had gone very quiet when she said it, and then looked at her with the kind of gratitude that is too deep for immediate articulation. "Margaret," he said. "If you like it," she said. "I like it very much," he said. Margaret was 3 months old when Alina visited again in the winter of 1878, and Alina held her niece with an ease that spoke of someone who had become comfortable in her own life, comfortable enough to extend herself generously into other people's. Alina had her dress shop by this point, operating out of a proper storefront in Kansas City, and she talked about it with the bright specificity of someone describing something they have built with their own hands and mind, which she had. Clara listened and felt a particular happiness for her sister that was distinct from her own happiness and no less intense for that. She had worried when she left Boston about Alina most of all. She had left her sister behind in a situation that was not Clara's fault, but which Clara had felt responsible for in the way that older siblings do. Watching Alina sit in the kitchen of the Colt Ranch house with little Margaret in her arms and talk about her shop and her plans and the particular satisfactions and aggravations of running her own business, Clara felt the knot she had carried around Alina's name finally dissolve entirely. She wrote to her mother in the spring of 1878, not the careful, formal letter she had written from Abilene all those years ago, but a different kind of letter, one that was warmer, that included news of William and Margaret and the ranch and James, that asked after her mother's health with genuine rather than polite interest. She did not pretend the past had not happened. She simply chose, as she had decided to choose, not to let it be the only thing the future was made of. Her mother wrote back. The letter was stiff in places, as her mother always was, and it did not contain an apology in any form that could be directly quoted, but it contained something that functioned as one if you read it generously, which Clara chose to do. Her mother expressed pleasure that Clara was well. She asked about the baby. She said, in a sentence that took up only one line but which Clara reread several times, that she hoped Clara was happy. She wrote back, "I am." The summer of 1879 was a good one, warm and wet enough in the right sequence to make the grass excellent, and the cattle fat and contented. The Colt Ranch had 3 full-time hands now, as the increased acreage required it, and there was a steadiness and prosperity to it that felt earned rather than given, which Clara thought was the best kind. William was 4, and he had his father's serious attention and his mother's tendency to ask questions that the adults around him had to stop and actually think about before answering. He could name most of the cattle in the near pastures and could tell you which ones were likely to cause trouble at moving time. He had opinions about horses that were more sophisticated than opinions a 4-year-old had any business having, and he expressed them with a calmness that was pure James. Margaret at 18 months was already demonstrating that she intended to be ungovernable in the most affectionate possible sense of the word. She had discovered that her brother could be easily alarmed by her proximity to anything she was not supposed to touch, which she used as a manipulation strategy with a sophistication Clara found simultaneously alarming and admiring. She laughed with her whole body and said the names of people she loved in a voice that made everyone in her vicinity feel they were the most important person she knew. One evening in late August of 1879, James and Clara sat on the porch after the children were in bed, in the particular peace of a day's end when the work is done and the world has quieted. The sky was extraordinary, deep blue-black at the zenith and still softly lit at the western horizon, and the stars were arriving in the incremental way they do in summer, one at a time and then suddenly all at once. James had his arm around her and she was leaning against him in the way she had been leaning against him for 5 years of evenings, the easy, complete fit of two people who have become each other's default orientation. "I want to tell you something," he said. "You tell me things all the time," she said. "I appreciate it." "I want to tell you something specific," he said. "About the fact that you drove up here in a rented wagon in April of 1873 with a broken bag and a name on a piece of paper, and that I am not sure I believed in luck before that afternoon, but I believe in it now." She tilted her head to look up at him. "I believe it was something more than luck," she said. "I think it was choice, yours and mine both." "Both," he agreed. "But I did not make any particularly brave choices. You made the brave choice. You ran toward something you did not know instead of staying with something you did not want. That took courage. I just happened to be what you found." "You were not just something I found," she said. "You were someone I recognized. There is a difference." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark, and she could see his expression even so, because she knew it by heart now, knew every version and variation it could take. "The ranch is going to be the best it has ever been in 5 years," he said. "I can see it. The land is right, the cattle are right. With the eastern pasture and the management you have brought to the accounts, we have a real future here, a big one." "I know," she said. "I have been watching the numbers. William is going to want to run it someday," he said. "I already see it in him." "I see it too," she said. "And Margaret is going to do something entirely unpredictable," he said, and there was great fondness in his voice. "Almost certainly," Clara said. They were quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I did not plan this," she said. "None of it. I had a name on a piece of paper and a great deal of desperation and some extremely impractical footwear. And I arrived here and you sat me down and gave me coffee and listened to my complicated situation without making me feel small or stupid or used up. And I think that was the beginning of it. The coffee and the listening. I remember you sitting across from me at that table," James said, "looking like you were prepared for absolutely anything, even though anyone could see you were terrified." "I was terrified," she said. "You did not show it much." "I showed it as little as possible," she said. "I had used up my falling apart. By the time I got to your table, I was past it." "That is one of the things I noticed about you," he said, "that you had clearly been through something considerable and had decided to be functional about it. I found that remarkable." "You found it practical," she said. "You are a practical man." "I found it remarkable and I subsequently discovered it was you," he said. "The two things are connected." She settled more comfortably against him, and the night moved around them, and somewhere in the dark the Kansas plain stretched out to all its enormous horizons, and the grass moved in the warm summer wind, and inside the house their children slept, and the lamp they had left burning in the kitchen sent its small steady light out through the window into the yard. "Are you happy?" she asked him, not because she did not know the answer, but because she liked to hear him say it. "Completely," he said, without any qualification or pause. "More than I knew how to be before you." She thought of Boston, of the parlor where her mother had sealed her fate without her, of Gerald Ashworth's collector's assessment. She thought of the railway ticket bought with pawn money, and the $3.40, and the smeared name on the paper. And she thought of all the miles of territory between then and now, all the learning and all the labor and all the evenings at the table with a lamp burning between them. She thought of William's serious 4-year-old face and Margaret's unstoppable laughter. She thought of Eleanor's dress shop in Kansas City, and her mother's one-line letter, and the March morning when the land survey records had won James the eastern pasture. She thought of a summer morning on a ridge with the cattle below them, and a man who had told her a true thing about himself in a way he had not expected to, and the beginning that had been contained in that moment without either of them quite knowing it. "I came here with nothing," she said, "except the name." "You came here with everything," James said. "You just did not know it yet." She looked up at the sky, at all those stars that had been there long before Kansas was Kansas, and would be there long after both of them were returned to the ground they were born from, and she felt the proper size of things, and the proper size of her life within them, and she found it was exactly, precisely enough. The years that followed settled into the kind of life that does not announce itself as extraordinary because it is too busy being good. The ranch grew steadily. 2 more parcels of land added by 1882. The herd expanded to a scale that put them among the larger operations in the county, and the name Colt became one that carried weight in the regional cattle markets in a way that made James's father's ambition feel fulfilled, and not merely continued. William at 7 was learning to ride fence with Tom, and asking questions about cattle breeding that Tom answered with the patient respect he gave to questions worth asking. Margaret at 5 had decided that she liked horses better than people, except for specific people, and that she intended to eventually have more horses than anyone in Kansas, a goal James regarded with complete seriousness when she told him. Clara had kept the household accounts for years, but by 1882 she had expanded her role in the business itself, corresponding directly with buyers and agents in the cattle market, negotiating terms that James then reviewed and finalized, a division of labor that had developed organically from their respective strengths, and that the men at the ranch had long since stopped finding remarkable. Bess told her once with some satisfaction that when Tom had first described Clara's involvement in the business dealings to a neighbor rancher, the neighbor had expressed skepticism, and that Tom's response had been a single sentence: "Wait till she outnegotiates you, and then tell me what you think." Clara had laughed when Bess told her this. She had also felt a fierce, private pride that had its roots somewhere in the Boston parlor where she had been discussed as a commodity, and which had flowered into something entirely different out here in the open air. In 1883, her mother came to visit. It had been 10 years since Clara had left Boston, and the woman who stepped off the stage in Abilene was smaller than Clara remembered, or perhaps only less formidable in the context of the life Clara had built, which had its own authority now. Her mother wore Eastern clothes that looked eccentric against the Kansas surroundings, and carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who is not quite sure of their welcome, but is too proud to show the uncertainty. Clara met her at the stage stop alone, and they stood looking at each other for a moment, and then her mother said, very quietly, "You look well." "I am well," Clara said. "You look like you belong here," her mother said, and it sounded like it surprised her, the observation, as though it had arrived before she could decide whether to say it. "I do belong here," Clara said, and then, because she was who she was and not who Boston had tried to make her, "Come and meet my family." James met her mother with a courtesy that was genuine and not performative, which was the only kind he had. William, who was 8 by then, greeted his grandmother with a serious handshake, and an assessment that Clara recognized as his father's. Margaret, who was 6, decided within 20 minutes that her grandmother was interesting, a verdict Margaret apparently expressed by climbing onto her grandmother's lap and examining her jewelry with frank curiosity. Clara watched her mother sit stiffly and then slowly, incrementally relax, as Margaret's complete and unapologetic interest worked on her. And then James set coffee on the table and said something dry and mild that made her mother laugh unexpectedly, and the laugh broke something that had been held together by effort for a long time. Her mother stayed 2 weeks. She and Clara talked in the mornings while James was out on the ranch, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee in the way that Clara had come to think of as the proper venue for important conversations. They talked about Clara's father, about Alina, about the years between them that were not recoverable but whose weight they could at least distribute more honestly now. Her mother did not apologize in words, but she apologized in other ways. In the way she looked at William and Margaret with something that was not just the usual pleasure of grandparents but something more specific, more aware, as though she understood that these children existed because Clara had been allowed to make her own choices, and that this understanding was not comfortable but was honest. The night before her mother left, she found Clara on the porch in the evening and sat beside her and was quiet for a moment. "He is a good man," her mother said finally. "James's name was not necessary." "He is the best person I know," Clara said. "I am glad," her mother said. "I am very glad." Clara reached over and took her mother's hand, and her mother held it, and they sat together on the porch of the Colt Ranch in the Kansas evening. And it was not a simple thing and it was not uncomplicated, but it was real and it was enough. Her mother left on the morning stage and Clara drove her to Abilene and they said goodbye on the wooden boardwalk in front of the stage office, and Clara hugged her and meant it, and her mother held on longer than Clara expected, and when she pulled back her eyes were bright. "Write to me," her mother said. "I will," Clara said. "I always do." She drove home through the late morning light with the Kansas plain around her, and the June sky very blue, and she thought about the years and the distances and the strange, ungovernable way that lives move toward what they need if you let them. The ranch road came into view and she turned the wagon onto it, and she could see the house from here, and the barn, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney, and she could see two small figures in the yard. One of them clearly William because of the measured, deliberate way he moved, and one of them clearly Margaret because she was at a full run for no apparent reason. And she could see James coming around the side of the barn with something in his arms that resolved, as she drew closer, into a very young foal that had clearly decided to investigate the yard and needed to be redirected. She pulled up at the hitching rail and climbed down, and James looked up from the foal with the expression that she had first seen in all its fullness on a December evening in the kitchen, the open, glad one, the one that had arrived and stayed. "How was she?" he said. "She was good," Clara said. "She was really good." William came over and took charge of the horse with the serious competence of an 8-year-old who knows exactly what he is doing, and Margaret arrived at Clara's side with breathless speed, and immediately wanted to know everything about everything, and James handed the foal off to one of the hands and came to stand beside her, and she leaned into him for a moment with the comfort of someone who has been away and come back to the place they belong. "Welcome home," he said quietly, just for her. She looked at the ranch, at all of it, the house and the barn and the land running out to its enormous horizon in every direction, the cattle on the far slope and the garden putting up its early summer abundance, and the two children who were the best thing she had ever made or done. "I never thought I would have this," she said. "When I was sitting on that stagecoach heading west with $3 and a name I did not know if I could trust, I could not have imagined this." "Neither could I," he said. "And I was already here." She laughed, and he smiled, and William looked at both of them with the affectionate tolerance of a child who has long since made peace with the fact that his parents are inexplicably happy with each other. And Margaret said something to the foal that no one could quite hear, but that made the foal's ears twitch with what looked like genuine interest. That evening, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Clara sat at the table with the household ledger and James sat at the other end with one of his books, and the lamp burned between them the way it had been burning between them for 10 years of evenings. And outside the Kansas night moved across the plain in the enormous, indifferent, beautiful way it had been moving since long before either of them arrived to notice it. She looked up from the ledger and he looked up from the book, in the way they did, the way they had been doing for so long that it had its own grammar, its own set of meanings that required no translation. She had fled east with nothing but a name, and the cowboy who had claimed her, gently and without condition, in a kitchen on a Kansas ranch on a spring evening in 1873, had changed everything about her, not by telling her who to be, but by giving her the ground and the room and the steady, unhurried love to find out for herself. She had found out. She looked at the ledger and then at the lamp and then at him, and she thought, this is it. This is exactly it. And it was.